I welcome everybody to tonight's debate, Do We Need Economic Growth? An exciting and interesting topic. I'm glad so many of you have made it here, despite the football game. I think we've got quite a good panel. And I'm going to introduce the speakers now in the order that they will be speaking. But before I introduce the speakers, I want to say that this is part of an international sort of setup, because we are having the same debate in other European cities, in London, in Sofia, in Vienna, because this is part of an international network, TTT, Time to Talk, the European Houses of Debate. We're very interested in having as open a debate as possible, so our main aim is to get you, the audience, in later to make comments and ask questions, and challenge our speakers here tonight. So please do. So as you listen to them, just think of what you might want to say and what you might want to ask them. So, my name, by the way, is Sabine Beppler-Spahl. I'm the head of Freiblickinstituts. It's an association which was founded 1.5 years ago to do exactly what we're doing here tonight, to organize open and controversial debates. So, let me move to our panel. I think we will start with Fücks tonight.
Up to you.
Yeah, so, yeah, that's right. I was told I was the boss here. Okay, so Ralf Fücks has written widely on environmental policy and political economy. He's president of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. He has been a leading figure of the Green Party in Germany. He has also been senator for the environment and urban development in Bremen. He's also the author of a book which I can highly recommend to you. The book, the English title is Green Growth, Smart Growth, which was published last year. It's also got a German title. The German title, I'm sure you will say.
Intelligent wachsen, die grüne Revolution. Gibt es inzwischen aber auch auf Russisch und Polnisch.
Oh, well, I'm sorry I don't have the Polish title here, but not the Russian title, but English and German is good. So, our second speaker tonight will be Dr. Nikos Sotirakopoulos. Nikos is a lecturer in sociology at Loughborough University. His thesis has focused on the demise of radical progressive politics. He's also currently researching the rise of the sharing economy and is working on a book on the rise of lifestyle from the New Left to Occupy movement. Our third speaker is Dr. Hendrik Hagedorn. He's a lecturer in economics at this university. I must say, I forgot to say this actually at the beginning. It's a good thing that I remember now. Many thanks to the university for letting us use their room. It's not the first time we've been able to use this. We've been treated very, very generously by BITS University. Anyway, Dr. Hendrik Hagedorn is a lecturer here at this university. Before that, he was an assistant at DIW, which is the German Institute for Economic Research. He's a specialist in Austrian economics, I think.
That's right.
But he's not only an economist, he's also a physicist, which I think is very exciting. And I don't know why a physicist actually turns to become an economist, but maybe you can say that.
It's more interesting.
Okay, good, all right. Then,
more debate.
Our fourth speaker tonight is Georgi Medarov, who's come over all the way from Sofia. Georgi is a sociologist who teaches critical sociology at the University of Plovdiv in Bulgaria. He also works as a researcher at the Bulgarian Friends of the Earth branch, and he's a founding member of the New Left, of an organization called New Left Perspectives. He has co-published various works on political economy and critical historical sociology. So we're very glad that Georgi has come all the way from Bulgaria. Then our last speaker, last but not least, as we say, is Daniel Ben-Ami. Daniel has worked as a writer for over 25 years. He writes, amongst others, for the Financial Times, but also other well-known newspapers. His book, Ferraris for All, the title it's really the title of the book, which I've read, I can also highly recommend it, was published in its second edition, or has been published in its second edition already. His book on global finance, titled Cowardly Capitalism, was recommended by the Baker Library of Harvard Business School. So, yeah, and without much to do, I'll pass the word on to Mr. Fücks.
Maybe we should close the door.
Yeah.
Okay, I will try to do it that way. Thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to this quite promising debate in this international setting. The title of this event is such broad that it's will be maybe hard to find common ground for our discussion. When I had a closer look to the invitation today, I stumbled over the title, "Do we need economic growth?" I think this is a quite hypothetical question, at least in a global perspective. Of course, in highly developed and relatively rich and prosperous countries like Germany, with our demographic decline, it could make sense to discuss if we need economic growth in the future. But even here I would prefer a debate on which kind of growth, both in environmental and in social terms. But if you're looking to the globe in a wider perspective, the question is not if, the only question will be for the decades to come, how the global economy will grow. We are still living in an era of global growth. And what happened in Europe in the 19th century, the transition of agricultural countries into industrial countries, is happening now on a global scale. And it doesn't affect only some 100 million people, it affects billions of people who are moving from a very poor agricultural life into a modern, mainly urban and industrial lifestyle. And this, of course, is about economic growth, and economic growth at a large scale. Same with the growth of the global population from now around about 7 to at least 9 billion until the midst of the century. 2 billion more human beings with all their needs, but also with all their productive potential. This is about economic growth. And to mention a third factor, a third driver of economic growth, urbanization. Now, for the first time in human history, around about half of the world population is living in cities. And this will go up to 70 to 80% until the midst of the century. So the number of citizens, of people living in cities, will double, with a huge amount of construction, housing, infrastructure. And this is about material growth, it's not post-material growth. So it's by far no speculation to forecast that the global economic output, products and services, will around about double within the next 20 years. This would be based on an annual global growth rate of 3%. Over the last 25 years, we had an annual average growth rate of 4%, in spite of all the volatilities and crises of the global capitalistic system. And at the same time, and this is my specific angle I'm discussing this question, at the same time we are transgressing the environmental boundaries of the global ecological system of which the human civilization is depending from. Climate change is only the tip of the iceberg. It's about loss of fertile soil in huge dimensions every year. It's about acidification of oceans, also a result of the growing influx of CO2, which is absorbed by the seas. It's about these enormous amounts, this avalanche of waste released into air or into seas and rivers. It is about air pollution. If you're going to China or cities like Delhi, it has become a dramatic health problem. So if you take that serious, it's absolutely clear that business as usual will lead us into ecological turmoil, which also will create enormous political conflicts and social turmoil. If only the meltdown of the ice shelf of the Antarctic and of Greenland will go on in the speed it does now, we will see a sea level rise until the end of the century between 5 to 7 meters. And this would affect the livelihood of 2 billion people. That's dramatic. So, but if no growth in a global perspective is no option, and I would not wish for it, because growth, economic growth, still is the engine of social progress for billions of people. And at the same time, business as usual would be a crime to future generations. What's the conclusion? Or what's the solution for that puzzle? It's decoupling economic growth from natural consumption. Decoupling economic growth from emissions, not only CO2, and the consumption of not renewable natural sources. This is about 3 major transformations the industrial system has to go through over the next decades. The first one is efficiency revolution, making more out of less, producing more wealth with less natural resources. This is what Hans-Ulrich von Weizsäcker and Emory Lovins and other thinkers, green thinkers for decades have been demanding factor 4 or factor 6, so increasing resource productivity in big steps. To give you a simple example, if you change conventional light bulbs by LED light, you can save electricity by 80% at once. Same applies with construction houses, buildings, which can produce more energy than they are consuming. Thousands of examples for that kind of efficiency revolution. The second major transition will be, and already is, the departure from fossil fuels toward renewable energy sources. So decarbonization is the key word. And this means fundamental change. The whole history of industrialization and the enormous economic growth over the last 200 years had been based on the consumption of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels concentrated solar power over millions of years accumulated. Coal, oil, and gas. And this is the main root cause for climate change. So we have to move to renewable energies. And if you're looking to it globally, it is already happening. Germany by far is not an exemption. The main growth of renewable energies is now happening in the emerging and developing countries. China alone in the last year had new photovoltaic installations of 14 gigawatts. This was more than double than new photovoltaics in Europe, in whole Europe. And this is mainly due to a dramatic decline of cost for renewable energies. Cost for new photovoltaic installations went down by 80% over the last 6 years. For wind energy, minus 60% in the same period. So the solar revolution has already started. But it will not end with that. My vision is that finally the economic system in the society of the future will be based on photosynthetics, so the transformation of sunlight, water and CO2 into energy. And the third great transition will and must be move from linear chains of production, from mining to waste dump, to kind of cycling economy or a zero waste economy in which every residual substance will return either in the agricultural and biological cycle or into the industrial technological cycle. No waste. This is also learning from nature or from the biological system. There is no waste in biology. There are only synergies. So this is the idea of a synergetic economy. Synergetic not only in itself, but with the natural system. If you would look for a more philosophical description or term, it would be moving from exploitation of nature to co-evolution or cooperation with nature. Those of you who still are remembering Marx will know his famous phrase in his early writings about naturalization of humans and humanization of nature. You can find similar thoughts of Ernst Bloch in his idea of an alliance technology, so in alliance with the natural environment and not on the expense of it. And finally, I think my time is over. If you are asking who will be the change agents and who will be the drivers of this really deep transition, first, policy matters. I would say this is maybe the most important factor. Re-regulation of the markets, implementing ecological guidelines for the private economy, the internalization of environmental cost into the price mechanism, be it by environmental taxes or by pricing of CO2. Efficiency standards for buildings, for vehicles, for all kinds of electrical machinery, but also transparency for consumers about the ecological footprint of products. And this is the second major change agent, civil society. NGOs in their critical capacity putting pressure on governments and on companies, but also the creative side of civil society, social and cultural inventions, like sharing economy and changing cultural patterns, a different kind of mobility. Not less mobility, but smarter and better, combining bicycling, walking, a modern public transport and car sharing if you need it. So this is civil society or consumer power and citizens' power. And then third, it's about entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship in the essential sense of the word. Inventing new solutions for human needs. And the last one will be science, because a lot of these transformations will be science-driven. Over the next decades, we will see an unprecedented scale and speed of innovation, combining information technology, biotechnologies, material science, and it's already happening. If you have the privilege to go to Silicon Valley, you can already see it. So I'm not sure if we finally will win the race against the clock, the race against climate change and environmental degradation. But I'm deeply convinced that we have a good chance to do it, and that we should not talk only and not so much about threats, but about opportunities and a better future. Thank you.
I'll time myself, I'll self-police myself. So, what is an example of economic growth? Only in my lifetime, and despite a rising population, which, by the way, it's something to be celebrated, because a rising population means that people don't die, which is a good thing. So 1 billion people in China and India came out of poverty. And this happened because of economic growth. Now think, for example, if 1 billion people would have survived cancer because of a cure, that cure would be celebrated as the biggest news ever. And yet economic growth is more and more problematized, sometimes by a tiny minority of people saying directly that we need less growth or growth is something bad, but usually with kind of an under-the-line message that yes, maybe growth is good, but. And where does that come from? Why do we have this growth skepticism? To begin with, it is the old conservative idea that having too much or wanting too much is a bad thing. Already in ancient Greece, there was the legend of Icarus, who had wings, but he flew too high and he came close to the sun, and the sun kind of burned his wings. And I grew up in school with this kind of message that, careful, because if you want too much, something very bad is going to happen to you.
Prometheus. Think about Prometheus.
Yeah. And this was also, this motive comes back again in Christianity. But in a political sense, it makes a comeback in the 1960s with the rise of the New Left. So when socialism, and by the way, it's interesting to remember that back in the day, the left and what we would call environmental thought were in different camps. For example, Maxim Gorky, the Soviet writer, he had a famous kind of quote. He said, when the Soviet when the Soviet man defeats the class enemy, then it will be the time to face the ultimate opponent, which is nature. And what did he mean? He meant nature as limits. So, but when socialism and when the left lost the battle with capitalism on which was the system that would deliver the goods, the left decided to move the goalposts, or basically decided to abandon the field and go and play in a different field. And now, growth and prosperity were problematized, and were problematized as bringing various bad things, such as destruction to the environment, but also lately it's kind of problematized in a psychological way, that wanting too much or living in a society that has too much could influence your kind of psychic, your psychic well-being. And even more recently, we have the rise of the inequality debate, which is kind of in a way, another stage of this kind of growth skepticism. But recently, political and cultural elites jumped in this bandwagon, and suddenly growth skepticism is not anymore kind of in the field of the left. There are two problems with a society that hasn't got economic growth. I would say, if you want to see a society without growth, what it would look like, come to Greece. And actually, such a society defeats the purpose of the good things that people who have maybe genuine kind of objections on economic growth. Such a society has less kind of time to face economic, environmental problems, and also social mobility is restricted, and all these factors. But even more importantly, people will always want more stuff. Therefore, a society of low growth can only be an unfree society. It would be a society that, to use the quote by the political philosopher Robert Nozick, it would have to be a society where a central planner, a ruler, would have to forbid capitalist act between consenting adults, which basically means people pursuing and producing what they value as goods. Now, because of the crisis, because of the economic crisis, growth has been, in a way, re-evaluated. So we are told that we need economic growth. But what actually this means is not clear. For example, in Greece, growth is used as kind of a catch-all phrase against austerity. So the question was, are you for austerity or are you for growth? But actually what this meant is, I am for growth meant I am against austerity. But with growth, what was actually the meaning was basically government going back to spending more money that the government does not have. So rather than embracing growth as something aspirational, as having more stuff, as producing more stuff, it was just an idea of going back to the good old days. And one last point, no, actually, no, I'm out of time, so I'll mention this maybe later. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to use my time to harmonize the debate a little bit, because we've heard a lot about various topics already, and it's going to be too much for one evening anyway. So,
predicted it.
but anyway, so let's try and keep the debate to the topic where we started, and I think this is the topic of growth. Now, Mr. Fücks is completely right. We should first of all clarify what kind of growth are we talking about, or what kind of growth are we looking at. I think the term growth refers to GDP growth. Yeah, this is what is commonly understood when you talk about growth. There are also other types of growth. We could say growth of the use of natural resources and all that kind of thing, but this is actually not what we understand by growth. When we ask the question, do we need economic growth, then this is actually correctly understood, do we need economic GDP growth? This is, I think, the question that we should address first. Now, to answer that question, we should also ask the question, who needs GDP growth? And my answer is, it's not the society. I could well imagine in a saturated society or a prosperous society like ours, that people move away from growth ideology. That they say, well, I prefer working part-time, I choose to do gardening instead of consulting, and so on, and that people have, and I think this is what we already see is happening. So I don't believe that people really need growth. They choose growth sometimes, and sometimes they don't. Historically, they have chosen growth, yes, on a large scale, and they do still to some extent today, but I think this tendency could be reversing. in a postmodern society. And nothing is wrong with that, in my opinion. However, we have one big player in this economic system who desperately needs growth, and this is the government. And why? Why? Because they have so much debt. And this is the actual reason why we need growth. Because if the growth record ceases or goes down, then tax revenue is going down, and this poses a major problem to all the highly indebted governments. So then, what do? Well, they ask the central bank to launch the printing press and print some more money. So in order to foster and steer growth, and this is how this train is kept moving. Yeah. So, but this only means, if the government does this, it only means more debt and more debt and more debt. And this is why we need exponential growth. So it is a question of government intervention and not a question of societal choice, because the last question could be answered in one way or another. Let me leave it here for a moment.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. And I would also try to keep it short as much as I can. I'll try to step on some of the things that have been already said. And there was this element of kind of problematizing the whole question of the debate, right? Do we need economic growth? And the questions of what kind of growth was posed first. And I think this is really important because there are certain reasons that we could have economic growth that are quite destructive, like the ones that create climate change, but also war and military occupations and so on. They could also contribute to growth. But also I do believe that the other question is also important, who is this we that needs economic growth. However, I think here it is a little bit more complicated because society is not divided only between the society and then the state as something external. I think it's much more nuanced and complicated than this. Let's say there could be destructive forms of investment like privatizing natural parks or deforestation and so on and so forth, which is also enriching certain very specific groups of people, like the privatizers and so on and so forth. And also it's the same with, let's say, the wars in the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. Many people were found them quite profitable, and there was a big fortune for certain companies. They invested in the rebuilding of these countries and so on, but this does not mean that everybody was happy with it. There was a lot of resistance to this war, even here in Germany and all over Europe. That's why I think it's a little bit more difficult to say, is it only governments versus societies? And I think we have to pose this question about we in a more kind of complex, it seems to me, way to differentiate between different countries, societies, social groups, and so on and so forth. But clearly, these destructive forms of growth that led to climate change and so much misery that we see today in the world provoked certain forms of, what you said, growth skepticism. But I do also think that this kind of growth skepticism, sometimes in some of its forms, it's framed also in too general terms, exactly not asking the question of who is this we that need or not growth and so on and so forth. But it seems to me that this question of we should be posed in more political terms. What I mean is by this kind of overgeneralized kind of critique of growth is, let's say, we have this maybe post-60s style of new left in a kind of a new form criticism of growth, which is framed in terms of criticism of consumption, of consumerism, basically this kind of a moralistic imperative towards individuals. Don't take another plastic bag at the shop, don't drink coffee in a plastic cup, and so on and so forth. And this kind of left with maybe criticism of consumerism, this moralistic critique of consumerism based on kind of individualistic understanding of where it should be directed, it's seen a strange and important, I think, affinity with another form of criticism of consumerism, a much more efficient form, which would be the criticism to consumerism that is posed by the Troika, by the IMF in Greece, for example, which is essentially the same. You should tighten your belts, consume less, and so on and so forth. even though the opposing side of not consuming is not this kind of, let's say, kind of new left understanding of, I don't know, simple life, blah, 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 but it's to be more productive. It's basically calling eat less, work more kind of thing. But nevertheless, it is in a strange affinity with this naive, let's say, simplistic criticism of consumerism. Therefore, I think we should try to differentiate between at least two types of consumption. That would be the consumption that is productive consumption, that is being defended, let's say, by the IMF and by the, let's say, the forces of austerity, if you want to call it. So this call against consumption is for another type of consumption, productive consumption. That is consumption of materials and labor power and so on for more growth. So here we have, I don't know, tighten the belt, so eat less, work more. So we have like productive consumption being defended, and we have to differentiate this productive consumption based on efficiency, productivity, and so on, to another type of consumption that is unproductive consumption, let's say. And maybe we have to try to imagine to convert this slogan of eat less, work more to maybe ask the question: are there some people who might need to work less and eat more? And I come from a country that we have about 10% of the population living in slums, basically, and they have no water and sanitation. They basically recycle absolutely everything, and they recycle many times. And it's like the most efficient. I mean, some ethnic minorities are enclosed in kind of really basically slums, the worst type of you can imagine. So this is the absolutely most efficient form of production. No consumption at all, working all the time. You cannot be more efficient if you don't consume anything. It's like the maximum possible efficiency you could get, right? So I think this question of like maybe converting this austerity imperative that maybe it's not maybe universally adequate, but to ask maybe some people need to maybe work less, as I said, and eat more. And as I said again, this should be posed in I think political terms, in the sense of when we ask the question of wheat and the question of interests and so on, it should not be posed in terms of like the agent behind this kind of expected transition towards renewables, which I am also sympathetic with, highly, but I think we should not imagine it as some kind of a abstract scientific force that, I don't know, is some kind of a new invention that is going to save humanity from tomorrow and so on. I think these technological utopias should be also questioned, again, as I say, in political terms, because sometimes, and we do have examples of this, where under the slogan of green innovation and so on, all kinds of problematic things have been passed, like, for instance, biotechnologies might also mean transformation of land that is used to grow food, to grow agri-fuels, and actually this might be an incentive for land grabs throughout the world. And this is actually also defended by the EU, by its renewables directive. So I think this question should be posed. Like, for instance, in Bulgaria, we actually have quite high share of renewables. In 2013, Bulgaria reached its renewables goal for 2020, which was 16, and we're about 20% now. I think maybe it's even higher than Germany. I don't know what's the German figure, but the Bulgarian one is quite high. And at the same time, in 2013, we had huge social protests against price electricity hikes, and we have extremely high levels of energy poverty. There are actually some people died because they couldn't afford to heat up their homes. And this movement was like really a movement of despair. I mean, about 10 people set themselves on fire on the streets as a protest. And at the same time, I'm not saying it's renewables to blame, but there is also another important question, like, why is this happening, you know? And if this is not questioned in like political terms, we risk to have this slogan of green growth and so on misused by the same elite that that kind of crashed the planet in the current situation, basically.
Francis Bacon, not the painter by the way, there was a painter of the same name. Francis Bacon was a scientist and politician and statesman who lived in Britain about the same time as William Shakespeare. In fact, some people credit him with writing Shakespeare's plays, which I think is nonsense, but he lived at the same time as Shakespeare. The reason I think Bacon is central to this discussion is he had two key insights, at least for the purpose of this discussion, two key insights. One was a scientific method. In other words, natural science progresses through experimentation. Now, we take that for granted today. We think, oh yeah, of course, scientists, experiments, we take it for granted, as Heinrich knows as a physicist, you know, from first-hand experience. We take it for granted, but it was an incredible insight that really Bacon played a key role in bringing to the fore. More pertinently for this discussion, Bacon took the view that humans should try to shape nature for the benefit of humanity. In other words, humans should not live in harmony with nature. Humans are not just a subsidiary of the natural world. Humans should try to master nature, to shape it for their benefit. And incidentally, I think when Marx, following Bacon, talked about the socialization of nature, that's what he was talking about. Human beings taking more control over nature. Not living in harmony with nature, the opposite of living in harmony with nature. Taking control over nature. And I think that insight is hugely important and very relevant to this discussion because it's really a precondition for all the things that we enjoy around us. We have reshaped the natural world. We have increased labour productivity hugely, not just resource productivity, labour productivity hugely, people producing a lot more, and humans have hugely benefited from that. You know, look around you. You know, universities, electricity, airports, life expectancy hugely increasing. You know, average human life expectancy in 1800 was about 30. The average human being lived to be about 30. Now, the average life expectancy across the world, you know, for the 7+ billion people in the world, is over 70. Huge improvements. I could go on and on and on and on, but that insight that humans should try and reshape nature, to master nature, to control nature, not to live in harmony with it, I would say that was really central to create the basis for economic growth and central to a human-centred worldview. You know, that's what we really have to understand. So when we're talking about economic growth and prosperity, we're not just talking about consumerism, although I absolutely agree with Nikos as a kind of snobbish disdain. It's very nice for middle-class people and Greens to say, oh, these horrible people consuming too much, why should they consume too much? I'm all in favour of consumption, a lot more consumption, people consuming more, but economic growth is much more than that. It's about reshaping the world to benefit humanity. And in a world where we have still billions and billions of people living in poverty, I think it's very clear that we need that. But even in Europe, you know, the European economy, and I include Britain in this, and Europe, continental Europe, you know, completely stagnant economies. And I think one reason for that is precisely because the kind of growth skeptic ideas that people have referred to have become completely mainstream. We've lost confidence in economic growth. So people say, as Mr. Fücks does and other people on the panel, they say, oh, of course we're in favour of growth, of course we like growth, but it's got to be carbon neutral. And we mustn't, you know, we must only use renewable energy. We can't use fossil fuels, we can't use nuclear energy. And of course, you know, we're in favour of growth, but we should drive fewer cars. Those people, you can agree with them or disagree with them, that is, unfortunately, I would argue, the complete mainstream view. Green thinking has become completely mainstream. What I think we need to do, if Europe is to get out of the economic mess that it's in, where so many people are living in poor living standards, and where the billions and billions of people in the world can enjoy the living standards we take for granted, we need a lot more economic growth. And in addition to that, I think we should rehabilitate Francis Bacon and put him to his proper place in the pantheon of humanity, you know, for his great insight about what humans should try to achieve.
That's what I meant, a controversial debate. Can I see shows of hand? Yeah.
Hello, does this work? The question that I would like to ask is maybe a nice example of what you are talking about, maybe in my opinion. My theory would be that in kind of right now, at least in Germany, I assume also in other countries, have a discussion that also with the department for, what was that, the Institute for Economic Development or something, Right now we have a discussion growth for growth's sake, like where the discussion goes about we need growth, and there's no discussion what we need it for or why. And at least for me personally, a nice example of this is actually Volkswagen with the emission scandal. I do remember about maybe a year ago, there were quite a number of articles from analysts, from journalists, also from Volkswagen themselves, where they were very proudly discussing that they were aiming to become the largest car manufacturer in the world. And given their rather strong position in South America and China, they kind of had good ambitions to take over Toyota and General Motors. But as you could see from the emission scandal, they kind of detached themselves from the question, why grow? Like, to what benefit, actually? There was a question of profit growth, turnover growth, but not of social benefit growth for anybody. And so I kind of see that they kind of, they essentially, like, if you're honest about this, they essentially killed thousands of people, because that's what emissions actually do in the core of things. I mean, if you do that. On the other hand, I can also see why they grow, because you can see that in the car manufacturers, also in other industries, the small manufacturers die. So you kind of have to grow, or you vanish from the market. So I can see where they're coming from. So how do you handle that conflict between growth for growth's sake and growth for social benefit? Like, how do you handle that?
Okay, interesting question. Any more questions I'm going to collect as they come in? Yeah. Back there, yes, and then down here.
So I have actually two questions. You said that controlling nature is our goal, or that we should achieve, but does that really necessarily mean that we have to destroy it on its own? And my second question is, we said, I totally agree with the opinion that we need economic growth on its own. But do the world need economic growth, or just some, for example, the developed country need the economic growth for now? Because we, like Germany and all the big countries, or the industrialized countries, already had the process of going through that enormous economic growth, and the other developed countries, or the less developed countries, need that step to go through. So I'm asking my question if we all need the economic growth right now, or if we should first focus on the less economically developed countries, so we can then focus, if everybody is on the same level of economic growth, I'm calling it now, if we can focus on something else then.
Well, you all seem to be in touch with the bigger picture much more than I am. I happen to work for a firm in which their shareholder value is quite high, and yet they hire consulting companies to help them cut back on employees. So what you have here is shareholder value increasing and the number of employees decreasing, the employees in the company having to work harder to increase the shareholder value. That's the kind of growth that I think consists mainly of greed, and that's what I'm interested in finding out about. Why? What is it that drives people to deal on this level in our capitalist society? And why are there companies that exist specifically for the purpose of helping businesses make more money, even though they had been successful the year before, and to cut back on employees, which of course increases the gap between the haves and the have-nots?
Okay, I'm going to bring the panel back in. I think many of the questions are sort of related. So, good growth, bad growth, social, beneficial growth. Who of you wants to get back down? Okay.
So, I think one of the problems with growth is that it's become kind of a totem, it's fetishized. Specifically, again, coming from the viewpoint of Greece. So, for example, after 2012, the idea was that the government would say, and now we should have growth, and growth would happen. But actually, growth does not happen like that. It's not the command that is given. Growth is basically, as I said before, people coming together and trying to do something productive. The problem is that even in a country deep in crisis like Greece, sometimes the government does not let this happen. Now I wish that, as Professor said, I wish that that growth was the targets of the government. But unfortunately, it is not. Let me give you an example. Those of you who are my age or older, you might remember that in Athens there was an airport, not the new one, the modern one, the Elliniko airport, which was by the sea. Now, since 2002, this space, which some people say it's the best piece of land for investment in Europe, it hasn't been used. We have an unemployment of 27%, but the government still does not decide to do something with that. Now a Syriza official, a government official, when asked, why don't you do something about that, that would give jobs to so many people? She basically said, look, we want growth, but we don't really want to be like Dubai. Which is weird. It's like me saying, okay, I want the job, but I don't want to work in Harvard. So the idea is, again, that growth was kind of a slogan, but when it came to the specifics, okay, in order to have growth, we have to let these people do X or Z. Or it could be something way more kind of small scale in Greece. Like some people try to, I don't know, produce a small kind of new kind of olive oil. But there are constant barriers again and again. So growth, it's not something that we need. It's people trying to do stuff that will produce benefits, maybe for themselves and their customers, or maybe for more people. But it's a process. It's not something that we can say, okay, this should be happen, and then it happens. And my second point, if you're really interested in the environment, you should be in favor of growth. Let me give you an example. You mentioned that we need to make more out of less. But see, for example, this one, the iPad. This is like 25, 30, whatever devices in one. I don't need any more maps. I don't need any more radio. I can see TV here. I have my compass here, my camera here. Everything is here. Imagine what is the amount of material saved because of this thing. Or as I saw a meme on the internet, it has a USB stick and it says, this thing has saved more trees than all the environmentalists put together.
Okay, so anybody else want to get back? Yep.
Well, yeah, some pretty fundamental questions, which is a very good thing. Two of them really fit together. I mean, controlling nature and destroying nature, I think that's a key distinction. Because I think that distinction is generally blurred by Greens in the discussion. So, which is why I really wanted to talk about Bacon, because it really brings out the idea that the separation is between should we try and shape the natural world, the environment for our benefit, which is what I'm arguing, and Greens who basically see the natural world as a limit. Their starting point really is the natural world, and they say, okay, we have to limit ourselves. I mean, my view is the natural world has absolutely no intrinsic value. The Earth is just a lump of rock, and if there were no humans, so what? I don't care about it. The reason that it's important is because humans can shape it and it can benefit humanity. That leads then on to the question of why do we need growth, which of course is the fundamental question. And I think fundamentally it's because it gives us choices. If you take an extreme example, if we're living in complete dire poverty, in fact we probably won't, there's a very, very high chance that we won't even live to reach our first birthday, but we might be doing back-breaking work for our short lives. That's it, probably not in education, women probably don't have access to contraception. All the things we take for granted very much come from growth, so it gives us choices. And even in a developed country like Germany, I think having more resources gives you more choices to do what you want to do. That's why it's so important. Of course, there's a difference between someone living in dire poverty and someone living in contemporary Germany, but I think ultimately it's up to people to decide what their limits are. If people are happy living on a very low standard of living, I think they should have that choice. I would say, look, I'm confident that a lot of people in Germany today would like to have a higher standard of living because they think that gives them more choices, and I think that's a good thing, that's a very positive thing. So really the fundamental reason for growth is that it gives us the choices and it enables us to realise our potential as human beings.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up also on some of those questions that were raised. And also it refers to some of what the others have said. We actually, sometimes I think we shouldn't worry about too much about whether we get growth or not, because it will happen anyway. Yeah? People trade, people interact, people see their opportunities, and then growth happens. And yes, it is for greed, but there's actually nothing wrong with it, because this is how the capitalist system works. And capitalism is not is not the end of the world. It's actually much more sustainable than any form of socialism that we've seen. And second, I want to say one thing, because this was the question that you raised, that I don't know, the emissions are killing people. I don't think that is the right way of putting it, to be honest.
Well, they made a decision: profit, or these carbon monoxides that are kind of dangerous to people, and they made a decision, and they didn't choose the emission standard; they chose the profit. And I think this is, in the end, killing people, because that's what emissions efficiently do. That I don't know the English terms there, but
well, I think we would have to rediscuss global warming at some point, but maybe not tonight. But I don't buy into that. I'm sorry.
You buy into greed.
Okay. Yes. I'm a little bit unhappy that you agreed so quickly to that capitalism is only about greed.
Oh, you're right.
I would disagree with.
Oh, you're right. Okay, yes.
So
please keep going.
Okay,
yeah.
But let's go back to the growth question. There seems to be a consensus, at least, that growth can never be an aim in itself, and that we don't want to live in a kind of central planned economy in which the government is introducing growth targets or degrowth targets. Makes absolutely no sense, also from an environmentalist point of view. In a market society with private decisions of consumers and then producers, as you said, is growth happening or not? And then I'm always a little bit, I find it dull just to talk about quantities instead about talking qualities. So which kind of growth would be asking for the quality of growth, or what should be good for? And growth is also in a capitalist system. It's not just about more of the same. Nico mentioned it, I think. It's always, if you look into the history of capitalism, the long wave of growth always had been based on innovation. So bringing in new technologies, new solutions to human needs, and of course opening the option for new needs. So it makes no sense to talk about the human needs in a static way. There's evolution. There's evolution of society, of civilization, and if we have the means, we discover new possibilities and new options which could enrich our lives. And why should that stop? Why? So what's about limits to growth? Are there none? I don't know if me, I think there are no limits to growth in an environmental term. Sometimes the way you have been talking about growth and controlling nature sounds very 19th century in my ears. Of course there are ecological limits to growth. For instance, the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb CO2, if we transgress it, we will end in climate change. So, and we will endanger literally the future of mankind. And same with other ecological limits to growth. But does that mean that these ecological limits to growth, the capacity of nature to reproduce itself in a way that is kind for human beings and our kind of civilization? Of course, nature is not depending from us. We are depending from certain ecological conditions on that planet. So does that mean that ecological limits are defining limits for human development or limits for economic growth? No, not at all. Because there's another factor, and this is creativity. This is ingenuity. This is finding new solutions. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, Robert Malthus, the famous English economist and priest, published his famous law on population. And he clearly explained that the planet will not be able to nourish more than 1 billion people. And he was right in terms of the productivity of the agricultural system in his time. But now we are 7 billions with 50% more calories per capita, and life expectancy has doubled. So there is room to move. And my argument is for a kind of smart growth which will expand the limits without destroying the environmental systems we are depending on. And this is not just about control of nature, but it is about co-evolution in a much more smart way than the early stages of the industrial society.
Thank you. Listening to how the discussion is going, I think I see. Yeah, sorry. Just to yeah, sorry. So okay. Listening to this discussion, now I see broadly, very broadly, like two positions. Let's say on the one hand we have one which is the more general position, like we need growth. We don't want to make a difference between types of growth and growth for growth's sake or growth with social benefits. And it's more this kind of generalizing position. But I'm more sympathetic to the points that were made based on more empirical examples, like Volkswagen case or the company, the gentleman here is working in which is experiencing economic growth, but at the same time cutting employment. So to me, this more empirical and less sloganeering kind of position is more interesting. Because it can make distinctions between different types of growth, concrete cases, and not to speak from the name, in the name of humanity as such, like humanity needs growth, blah, blah. And I think this, as I said, more empirical position is more interesting. Nevertheless, what you said about greed, and you also that capitalism is just greed, I think it's more complicated than this, and we have to look for the structural reasons that created the conditions for this system that, in order to sustain itself, has to kind of grow in terms of quantity for quantity's sake, to be based on this kind of, let's say, formal rationality, growth for growth's sake. And this system, and I think is based on, as I say, structural conditions that are historically made it possible not too long ago. It was not from the beginning of humanity and so on. The capitalism is quite recent in the end of the day. It's a few hundred years old, like industrial capitalism. It's based on this, let's say, idea of growth for growth's sake. And I think when we look into this more empirical way, in the, let's say, problematic aspects of this ideology, let's say, more specifically of growth for growth's sake, we could see series of concrete, specific problems. With, like, I can give other examples of many examples of where there was high economic growth, but this did not lead to any social benefits. Like, for instance, in Bulgaria, I also work in one environmentalist NGO, and I do political economy of agriculture in Bulgaria. And we have, in the agricultural sector in Bulgaria, we have tremendous amounts of growth. It's very efficient. In the agricultural companies are like very kind of effective with exporting all kinds of agricultural products. Globally, they're very integrated in the global markets and so on and so forth. It's also very centralized because they're very effective and they manage to kind of consume all other producers. And currently, about 4% of agricultural companies, they use 85% of the land. And so they are basically excluding the vast majority of the population from access to land. So we have high growth, but we also have quite a hard exclusion from the right to use the land, and which led to declining employment, so less people are employed as a result of this, but also to, and even maybe worse in a way, is that it led to kind of a very strong connections between this economic elite and the government. Like, for instance, the Minister of Agriculture is a person who used to be a CEO in one of those companies, you know. So the more we have this system of growth for growth's sake, it's not only not socially beneficial, but in the long term, maybe it's the end of democracy, you know. If we understand, of course, democracy is the power to the people, is the power of the majority. Because what kind of democracy can we have when 4% have 85% of the land? And I mentioned the Bulgarian ethnic minorities, like the Roma. People in Bulgaria have done some research with the Roma communities, and in Plovdiv, one Bulgarian city where is the biggest Roma neighborhood, it's about 50,000 people, and there people like to say, it's, in Bulgarian it sounds nice, nicer, как може да има свобода без ВиК, because it rhymes, but it means how could we have freedom if we don't have access to water and sanitation? And if we go, the more we have, again, this growth for growth's sake that is centralizing power into hands of very, very few people, then we have to say, if we defend this, we also have to ask ourselves, are we then against democracy in the end of the day? Because this is going to be the final point.
Okay. So, all right, I can see more shows. Yes, the lady over there.
I would challenge some of the points. Perhaps we are now talking 40 years about the green politics and the climate change. Maybe we have reached a tipping point and we should look into digitalization, and some technical freaks looking on artificial intelligence, which are saying in 10 years the man is overcome and Bacon has succeeded. So we have shaped ourselves to be no longer needed because machinery is perfect, and let it be only 15 years. I think it's at least a point which one should look at these days. And the second point is, and that is coming to the question on how do we create growth. Maybe we have the political real issue on societies, because ever more people feel a kind of intransparency, insecurity, not longer being able to grasp the things going on, and that might bring different challenges to us, and climate will follow later on. So because they will happen earlier than that.
Okay, the gentleman over here.
Yeah, I would like to raise two questions. One is a question of a little broader perspective of our mindset as humanity. How do we want to live on this planet? How do we see ourselves as part of this biotope where we are inhabiting? Can we still afford to think in terms of Francis Bacon conquering nature? Is that still feasible? And the other point is participation. We still have a subject of economics that is a very elitist one, and economists are determining our future, and I think it's time that more people get involved in discussing what kind of economy do we want to have, and how is it possible to find an economy where we can survive. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Take one more. Yep. The lady over there.
Thank you. I think Ralph's arguments can be quite persuasive, actually. If you are sitting, as we are, in a wealthy country, and we can express our, to use a German word, angst, about where we are and where we're going. But actually, you know, if you transfer those ideas into a country like India, for example, what happens is, and I sat next to a young man on a plane coming back from Australia recently, And he was a young Indian guy who'd gone off to do his master's degree in engineering in Australia, and was coming out with a lot of ideas, which were essentially green ideas, that were just so anti any sort of solving problems that India has, because they were so limiting and actually very anti-human in a sense, because it really was just taking on ideas that had been evolved in a certain situation and just saying, well, this is okay for everywhere. Well, I don't even think it's certainly not okay for there, and I don't think it's okay for us, because I think human progress is something that should be limitless.
Okay, I've got one more gentleman back there who had his hand up, and then I will take the panel back in. I'm glad you raised that, because it does link to the question raised by the young lady next to you about where do we need growth, and it wasn't 100% answered yet, I think, your question. So, okay.
2 points. First, I think it was Dr. Hagedorn who pointed out that when we are speaking about growth, what we mean is GDP growth. First question is, what do you think, would it make sense to exchange GDP as a base for growth, especially in the time of digitalization? And second, I'd like to point out there's still one open question from the young lady over here about if you look into different regions of the world, wouldn't it be useful to define growth for prosperous regions and for developing regions differently?
Okay, I'll get the podium back in, the panel back in. All right, keep it short.
I would say, if you're looking to the developing world, we should avoid this kind of paternalistic attitude. That the modern world, which was mainly created in Europe and the United States over the last 100 years, this is nothing for them. That's completely over, this kind of thinking. If you're looking to the real dynamics, especially in Asia, but also in large parts of Latin America, and it already started in Africa, it's absolutely clear that the broad majority of these people want just to have this kind of modern lifestyle with all its attributes, from higher education and professional health care to then mobility and a lifestyle with all the comfort we are used to. And I think they are right. A very different thing is the path of development. And again, from an environmental point of view, I think the crucial question will be if they will try to copy and paste the industrial system which developed here in Europe over the last century, or if they will leapfrog into another kind of economy, which I name a green or a sustainable economy, which is not a stagnant one, and not a steady-state economy, quite dynamic. So if they would try to just to repeat this fossil fuel-based model of development, it will be the final blow to our environmental system. And not only in terms of climate, but the sheer amount of natural resources you could not multiply from 1 billion to 6 or 7 billion people. So it has to be about much smarter kind of growth. Much smarter also in terms of our relation to the natural system. And this is what I mean with co-evolution. Nature is not just a mechanical system, it is deeply interconnected, and we have to have a much better understanding what are we doing when we are intervening in the biological and the physical world. And if you allow to come back to the VW question, because it was not answered.
That's right, it wasn't answered.
It was not, huh?
It wasn't answered.
Yeah, it wasn't answered. I agree with the criticism on VW. They have just been cheating. Just cheating. But what is the answer if you're looking to the global development of mobility? In Germany, we have annually between 3 and 4 million new cars. In China, in the last year, we had 17 or 18 million new cars in 1 year. So driving less in Germany at a global scale makes almost no difference. Almost no difference. And China is only the front runner of a global development. So what's the answer to that? Of course, we can try to reinvent the mobility system, putting much more emphasis on public transport, also because of social reasons. Rebuild our cities much more friendly for bicycling and walking. But we will not change this enormous demand for private cars over the next decades. Maybe we can minimize it a little bit or we can slow it down, but it will go on. So we have to reinvent the car. Completely. And maybe we can succeed in like changing the pattern that you don't need to have a private car. Yeah? But we will have millions and millions and millions of new cars done every year, so we have to move to electrical cars, battery technology or fuel cell technology. And the future of the car industry in Germany will depend if they manage to go through this transition much faster than they expected. Otherwise, they will become the dinosaurs of the industrial age and will just disappear.
Okay, 3 very quick things. First of all, we need to remember Greens are absolutely rubbish at predictions, historically, completely rubbish. So as Mr. Fücks correctly said, Malthus, he kind of made this prediction about human food supply, mass starvation, wrong. Limits to growth in the 1970s, people saying wonderful, fantastic. They made all these predictions about resource depletion, wrong.
I'm criticising them. That's not my point.
You criticise them in the introduction to your book, beginning of the first chapter and the beginning of the second chapter. The problem is that you follow exactly the same method. So rather than having a human-centred method to understand the world, you follow the method that we just have to accept the idea of natural limits. So for example, in your book, one thing you refer to, one possibility, not necessarily the answer, is to take carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that's necessarily the answer, but I'm confident that to the extent climate change is a problem, and I think it's often exaggerated.
It's just talking about photosynthesis. This is taking CO2 as a resource.
Please don't interrupt me. I'm confident human ingenuity and a human-centred approach can solve the problem. Secondly, labour productivity. The key thing to understand is not GDP, which is just a kind of rough measure of economic output. The key thing to improve is labour productivity. In other words, each person, on average, producing a lot more. Again, what these kind of eco-modernists say, like in Factor 4 and Factor 5, they counterpose resource productivity, in other words, making more from the resources we've got, which actually I think is a good thing, to labour productivity, which is each person producing more. If we need a better kind of growth, it's higher labour productivity. That is what I would really emphasise. Finally, yes, I'm absolutely happy to get into discussions of statistics, although I do think we need to get the principles right first. But in terms of the statistics, if you look at the recent BP Statistical Review of World Energy, June 2015 edition, which is a kind of authoritative study of world energy, you will find that in 2014, the latest data available, 86% of the world's energy use was from fossil fuels. Another, about 4% was nuclear, another 7% was hydroelectric, also a form of energy a lot of Greens don't like. 2.5%, in fact about 2.4% was renewables. And that includes solar, wind, biomass. A tiny, tiny percentage is renewables. If you in any kind of rapid way got rid of fossil fuels, didn't use nuclear, perhaps didn't use hydroelectric, not only would you have zero growth, you would have a huge collapse of the global economy. So rather than making most people better off, which is what we need, and I would argue is a moral imperative, we'd have the vast majority of the world's population worse off to a huge extent. You know, as I said, just think of the statistic, 86% of global energy consumption at the moment, globally, is fossil fuels. If you got rid of that very quickly, can you imagine?
It's changing rapidly.
Can you imagine? It's changing very slowly. Read the statistics. It's actually changing very slowly. You get rid of that 86%, then it would be a complete disaster. At least if you did it very quickly.
Yes, I think you're completely right on that, and I would like to affirm it. Also, we see the rise of renewables not because, as you said, there have been a cut in costs so much, but rather we see it because there has been a raise, an incredible raise in government subsidies. And that's the reason why solar and wind power are so much being produced. Now, let's come back to the questions that were raised. I think, yes, as a society, we could be most happy to take any form of wealth measure, because GDP is not a particularly great measure of wealth creation and prosperity. The problem is, however, that our government would not like to substitute away from GDP because they need the income from the taxes. And this is why GDP remains the point of reference for all growth discussion. And this goes really into the deepness of our economic system. But as long as we have the government debt problem in place, discussions are not likely to move away from GDP, at least as in an economic context. However, when I look at this discussion here tonight, then I see that we are moving tremendously away from GDP. We're moving into all kinds of discussions. In particular, we're moving into resource protection and development and all these things, which are actually not measured by GDP. Yeah, so it's actually a different question. But I would like, but if you want, I say something about this as well. Yeah. Two things that they burn under my toes, so I have to say them. First of all, when Mr. Fücks says that if we adopt fossil fuels and so on in the future, this will be a final blow to our planet, I don't think this is true. I don't think that climate change is man-made to a considerable extent. And second, even if it was, we accept that for the sake of discussion right now, then we would think of, like, how much would it cost us to, say, postpone this final tragedy by maybe a year? The answer is hundreds of trillions of dollars. And if you want to postpone it by just one day, then it would be like billions of dollars. And I don't think maybe this trade-off is something that we would like to pay. And finally, the best way to protect natural resources, in my opinion, is not through taxes, as you suggest, but through privatization, because only if things are private, then they are protected.
So let's privatize the atmosphere and the oceans.
1 second, we've got till 9 o'clock, and I'm going to let all the speakers come in and have the last word, but I've just seen a hand there. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask
you
one thing.
You need
the microphone, I'm sorry, the microphone that doesn't work. I'm curious to know what happened. Well, actually I want to refer to the title of this debate, because the title was, do we need growth or don't we need growth? And so I think we can't decide this question if we don't know in terms of GDP, because I think this is normally the way we use growth at the moment normally. if we don't know the potential costs and the potential gains that lies within this. And so it would be very interesting for me if we could have like kind of balance sheet that contrasts those possible gains and possible costs. I think that would help to maybe bring the debate together again.
Oh, we're not interested in bringing the debate together.
Oh, I am. I am. You don't, but I am.
Okay. One second. The gentleman in the middle. Anton.
Yeah, I just want to say like one thing. Like what I learned is that our planet is like a closed system. Like I don't know if this is the truth. I don't know, but I like the carbon dioxide that we produce. I think more or less stays where we are, no? And it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't go to the moon, or I guess. So this is what I learned. I don't know. But so the thing is, even if it's producing climate change or not, I don't think it's a good thing that we just release all this carbon dioxide, you know, and just say, you know, who cares? Okay, but this is one thing. The other thing is, I studied business administration, and I was actually a little shocked. I mean, okay, I was 18 years old, I had all these ideals and ideas, and in the end, all what I learned is revenues, cost, profit. That's all. This is really all I learned. It's really the optimum, and this is it. And I think this is, well, maybe the discussion is, what we have right now is, it's just about profit. And GDP, what is GDP? GDP is consumption and infrastructure, investitions, and this kind of stuff. And when I live in this nowadays world, like it's all about consumption, and maybe not about infrastructure anymore. And what I mean, and all what I've learned is that like we are in a golden state, so that we can only increase GDP actually by technology, yeah, by productivity increases, and. So maybe for the developed countries, it is maybe important to create infrastructure and all this kind of stuff, you know. But I think nowadays, when I see all these cars here everywhere and all these streets that we have and planes, is this really like making us happier? Is this really it? Like my grandparents, they didn't have any vacation, they didn't have a car, fridge, telephone, whatsoever. And I think they were still happy, you know. So I think maybe the question, like, what is it? I don't know, maybe a lot of questions, but
I want to see more show of hands. Might be the gentleman in the back there. Sure.
I just wanted to add. I think there's a great paradox in these green arguments, especially from Mr. Fücks, who says we want innovation, and innovation is the basic process we need to save the earth. And then we say, or Greens say, you already know the end. We need that, we need that, we need less of CO2, we need more solar power. But how should we know? Maybe there's sometimes an option to get CO2 out of the air. Maybe it's not a problem anymore. And there are so many possible opportunities in the future we can't expect, we cannot say. And if you always said in the beginning that you're really in favor of a lot of regulations to come to these ends, if you do too much regulations, which are driven by politics, politicians, fear, public discussions who are often not rational, we can really destroy these innovations we really need. And I see problems there in the future, and we need these innovations. And I think green politics are not the best option to get more innovation in the future.
Okay, that's interesting. Then here, and then I'll get
Yeah, to the gentleman over there who was talking about what makes us happy. There are actually studies about this. There are studies comparing nations. You'll find that almost every year the happiest nations are Switzerland, Scandinavia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. What do they have in common? They're all pretty highly developed. So I'll let that speak for itself.
Okay, I'll get one more person hasn't spoken in, and then I get the panel, and then I get all of you to in. So one person, yeah, you can get my microphone.
Cheers. That's one question specifically for Daniel Ben-Ami. I wonder why you're attacking Ralf Fücks so harshly, because isn't the idea of smart growth...
Because there's a certain idea of green.
Yeah, no, but isn't the idea of smart growth quite making, I mean, isn't it making sense? Because I do want growth. I want more things, I want more stuff, yes. But at the same time, I wouldn't want the Spree, the river Spree, which runs through Berlin, to be dirty and to be poisonous. No. So isn't the kind of things Ralf Fücks says, doesn't it all make sense? And then one more question to Ralf Fücks. I like you a lot more when you're talking about human ingenuity than when you're talking about regulations and policing and all that sort of things. And do you see a way how we could get away with less regulation, less policing? Thanks.
Question? So I'm going to get the panel.
Okay, I'll try to answer many questions together. So we heard about growth for growth's sake, profit for profit's sake, emissions. But the thing is, why do we burn fossil fuels? It's not because we want to piss off the Greens or Leonardo DiCaprio. And if I go out there and I start kind of plumbing the earth, I won't find any money there. The reason why we burn fossil fuels is because it delivers us the goods that we need in order to live, and to live happily. And this differs from person to person. Like, some people might not like their cars. If one of you does not like your car, I'm very happy to take it because I haven't got the car and I walk 1 hour per average every day. Another thing is, and I think somebody mentioned, is that we tend to lose the point, and this is the problem why kind of the ecological thinking is more of a mindset, I think, rather than focused on solutions. Let me give an example. Cutting down fossil fuels, which is kind of the slogan. If there was a research, I don't know if it's 100% accurate, but still, if by the year 2050, United States have 0 emissions, which means basically if everyone died, the difference it would make by the end of the century in terms of temperature would be 0.5. So if we throw 50 nuclear bombs and we obliterate them, then what will happen up till the end of the century is 0.5. Now this puts into perspective the whole discussion about, oh, we need to drive less, or if I only reduce my carbon footprint. Now actual solutions, such as carbon capture, or what we call, and it kind of scares people, geoengineering. The problem is, although this would be 10 times more efficient, because of what I call this mindset that sees kind of this anthropocentric view, that we take control over nature. Of course, respecting its laws. Actually, Bacon said, nature, in order to be commanded, must be respected. Okay? So, but still, he had this anthropocentric view. So, if we say, we will take command of the environment, we will change the climate, we will collect carbon, we have something like this and we will change the temperature of the world. Unfortunately, most Greens would be horrified. Would say, no, we don't want to go there. We don't want to play God. So the question is, do they actually want to find solutions? Or is it that they have this mindset that has become basically an ideology? And the last thing, because I think the gentleman here mentioned participation. Research after research in developing countries, when they ask these people, what do you need more? What do you want more? And what is your biggest fear? Climate change is very, very low in their priority. Climate change is just not a priority for them. Why? Because their priority is to bring food on the table and not die by the age of 50 and not die because of starvation. That's it.
Let's see. I can take 2 or 3 more.
It's not really a question, it's more a statement. All our history of mankind, we raced. We raced about everything. We raced in the wartime about who has the most weapons. We raced in the space race, who is the first man on Earth, on Moon, for example. And I think it's more important to first understand for the mankind and the surviving of mankind that we have to work together to get anywhere. We can't really race in that way who will have the most and the fastest growing economy and who will have the most and fastest growing renewable resources. So we first have to understand, I think, that we should work together and not be against each other in any way, because we are all on the same planet and on the same point at some level, because we're on the same Earth.
I agree that we have to shape nature or reshape nature, but are there any ideas how we can use natural resources and change our economic systems so that humans can really benefit from it, not only a very small elite, but the great majority?
Good. Can I see any more hands? Anybody else? The gentleman back there, you wanted to?
I just wanted to say that I noted a small contradiction over there, because when we are talking about the potential costs of reducing CO2 and trying to hinder the climate change, I remember that I heard exactly the same debate some decades ago about sour rain in the USA. The argumentation was exactly the same. First, we don't know exactly where are the sources. Second, it would cost far too much money. As it turned out, 10 years later, the costs were not something like $20 billion, but more like $20 million. So the contradiction that I see here is, yes, we can make innovations, but why should we make innovations in this field and only in the other field?
Okay. Can I see, does anybody still want to speak from the audience? Because if not, I would suggest I bring the panel in for the last round, and we're going to do it in the other way.
Reverse order.
The reverse order, thank you. That was the word I was looking for. Daniel.
Okay.
Sorry. All right, okay.
Well, first of all, just to emphasise, I have nothing personal against Mr. Fücks. I've never met him before this this discussion. I've never had any arguments with him. I'm sure personally he's very nice. I really want to emphasise that. And I think it is very important it doesn't just focus on him or on me or any other individual. I mean, what I really object about what he's saying, well, first of all, I think it's really important to realise that green thinking, and I'm using G with a lowercase g in English anyway, I'm not talking about the Green Party. I think green ideas, in other words, ideas of sustainability, and we have to respect natural limits, all that kind of thing, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, I would argue they're completely mainstream. So in a German context, it's not just the Green Party. Other people can...
They're mainstream, so what?
Well, so what?
Maybe in Baden-Württemberg.
So what is that the fact that they're mainstream is extremely harmful. That's the point I'm making. So in the German context, you have the CDU, you have the SPD, the mainstream parties and the Greens themselves, taking on these ideas of natural limits, and as a result of that, first of all, I would argue that it's a real contributor to the Western economies being in a real mess and being really stagnant. And also, we live in a world where, although people say, of course, we want people in the poorer countries to be richer, in fact, what is being used is a kind of politically correct way of saying that they should live in poverty. And that is absolutely unacceptable. So you say, well, why should these people in the... we might want these poor countries, poor people in poor countries, we might want them in principle to be better off, but the planet can't stand it. It's not me, I'm not a racist, I don't believe this is what's really being argued, but the planet just can't stand it. The reality is that if we're going to have everyone in the world with a decent standard of living, we're going to have to use a lot more energy, a lot more resources, a lot more fossil fuels, and we want that because human beings benefit. Someone asked about cost-benefit analysis. I just gave one example at the beginning. Average human life expectancy has increased from 30 in 1800 to over 70. That is absolutely huge. And really the whole of modern society around us is a result of economic growth. The benefits are incredible. Of course, if the Greens in the audience, who attack material goods, want to swap places with people in Africa or India, if they want to go and live without a fridge, or without electricity, and without cars, you're welcome to do so. I'm sure people in those countries would be willing to swap places with you. If you really believe what you say, then do it.
Whom are
For the
you
majority of
arguing
people in
with?
the world, they benefit hugely from economic growth.
Anybody calling for that?
I want to get back to the question posed about that we as a humanity should sit together, we live in one planet and so on and so forth. And I really like this idea and I'm very sympathetic to this and I wish it were the case, but louder and slower.
You've been told!
Okay. No, I will try to speak slower.
Stand on the table.
Okay, so I wish there was one humanity that could sit on one table somehow and discuss with itself how it could solve its problem, but unfortunately there is no one humanity as such. There are only concrete groups of people, concrete societies and so on. And unfortunately they very often stand opposing to each other. Like I was reading today this study about emissions that published by Oxfam recently, that only 10% of the people, the 10 richest percent of the people contribute 80% of emissions, right? And 50% of the poorest contributed only 10%. And we cannot expect that this complete antagonism with these two groups could, enable them to sit on one table, shake their hands, and so on and so forth. And that's why I think, unfortunately, it's a political question. And the language of politics was also used by many environmentalists in the South who talk about climate debt and try to remind that there is historical reasons for these huge inequalities globally. And I think it's a bit unfair to cry about countries in Africa, how poor the Indians and so on, and to forget to miss this elephant in the room, like what happened historically, like there was a role of British Empire and European colonialism in the first place. And these are important questions, and they're posed by some environmentalists in the South. And we cannot close our eyes and so on and so forth. And the next thing I want to say about, I witness this kind of popularity here among, about this kind of libertarian, let's say, positions, and I'm really sympathetic to this because it makes me feel at home. Because actually, we spoke in the debate, before the debate about this, and they are quite popular in Eastern Europe. I heard a lot about this, greed is good, regulation is evil, it leads to totalitarianism and so on and so forth. I mean, all these are also climate denial, and this really much makes me feel at home. And I think it's good now that what we see, because in the 90s there was this idea that we have so-called transition from totalitarianism to liberal democracy. Somehow Eastern Europe is going to westernize. But what I see now is maybe we see the easternization of Western Europe with the growth of these libertarian ideas. And as I said, they're very popular in Bulgaria. Not only, like many governmental officials share this idea, also particularly in state universities they're very popular. In general, public positions like state employees, many of them share this libertarian views of like regulation is bad, it's good, and so on and so forth. But what worries me is that I see what's the situation in Eastern Europe, and I'm not so sure if this would be the best thing for Germany, but maybe on a more positive way, a bit ironically, that maybe this is a way to get rid of this north-south divide if we see, I don't know, the westernization or the easternization of the West. By if these ideas come to power, maybe we'll have more possibility for a human dialogue, but based on misery, unfortunately.
I'm not going to say anything about growth anymore because I feel we've abandoned the topic anyway a couple of hours ago. I'm going to say something about the environment.
If you must.
I think the biggest problem, or I think probably the biggest problem for the environment in the world today is that we talk about climate change so much. Because it's not our biggest problem.
I agree, yeah.
And actually we can't even do much about it. We're just wasting our money and our resources. We should look into waste, into pollution, and all these things. And I'm really an environmentalist. I understand myself as an environmentalist, but I think we have different opinions on how we best protect the environment. And my fear is that the agenda of the green and the progressive left is actually leading to disaster, because what they are calling for is a new form of socialism. They want to protect the environment through government control, through taxes, all kinds of government intervention, and ultimately they want world taxes. They want a world government, and centralization in general has never created prosperity. That's our biggest problem.
Well, I will use a quote from one of the very few thinkers who actually went against environmentalists philosophically. Trigger warning, I'm talking about Ayn Rand. And she said, whenever you walk outside of a factory, out of a dirty grey factory, you should stare at it and say thank you. Because if it wasn't there, statistical odds are that you wouldn't even be alive today. And the second thing, because this kind of process is what made us what we are today, and what has kind of made the population rise from 1 billion to 7 billion. And the last thing, I will try to very quickly answer the original question, and I think the lady asked twice the same question, and I think it needs to be asked. Who needs what kind of growth? And the answer is there any problem?
You ran out.
And the answer is, I don't know, and the answer is no one knows. There is no one who can have like this god-like position who can say India X amount of growth, China X amount of growth, Germany X amount of growth. But actually, there is one way to find out, and this is leave people alone to produce what they want, as long, of course, as they don't harm others, and let people make their choices. Let people express. The only way to see who needs what growth is leave them alone and see if they want an iPad, if they want a car, if they want a fridge, or if they want to ride their bicycle, which is respectable and it's okay. But this is the only way we can find out, leaving people alone.
We'll find out.
It was really a funny experience tonight, that there's kind of left libertarian climate deniers. Sounding partly very much like, Koch brothers and this oil and coal industry. I'm really a little bit sad about that, because I think this is yesterday's debate. As if the only alternative would be business as usual, these kind of, let's say, destructive growth we have been seeing over the past, or kind of environmental global dictatorship. So, and this is a crazy alternative. Or if you're pretending there are no environmental limits, and the alternative would be to subordinate under these limits. Maybe this was a kind of classical current of green environmentalist thinking. In my biography, I'm criticizing Dennis Meadows and his colleagues with this kind of attitude you find in the report of the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth. I'm not for subordination, but the alternative to restrict ourselves and to subordinate unto nature is not to ignore or to deny that there are critical thresholds in the environmental system we should be very careful with. For instance, melting down the ice shield at the poles, or destroying the rainforests in Latin America and in Asia. This will have repercussions on the global environmental system, which will be very difficult, if not impossible, to control. And if we have run away climate change beyond 2 degrees with all the tipping points, when then come into place, for instance, the melting of the tundra areas in Alaska and in northern Europe, we will not have the technologies to control that. I'm very much in favor to use CO2 as a resource. This is kind of this idea of a cycling economy, and you'll find a lot of examples for that in my book. But to believe that these kind of technologies will save us if we will have exponential accumulation of CO2 in the future is really childish. Simply childish and irresponsible. And I don't understand why people who think about themselves as leftists are still promoting this kind of Stone Age economy, as if more output, more services and more wealth for people would only be possible with more input. What kind of thinking is that? More resource, we need more resources, we need more energy to have more wealth. Sorry, that's crazy. I'm talking about decoupling. And decoupling is no fantasy. It's already started. Even in China, since 2014, you have stagnant CO2 emissions while the economy still is growing by 6 and 7% per year. Why? Because China now is putting much more emphasis on energy efficiency and is building up rapidly renewable energies. Wind energy in China today is already by 50% higher in output than nuclear than electricity in China. And if you're looking to global investments in renewables, since 2 years we have globally more investments in renewables than in fossil fuels. Of course, it is right if you are just describing the status quo that today 85% of the energy is coming from fossil fuels. But I'm not looking to the status quo, but to dynamics of change. And my understanding of left policy was always about dynamics of change, and not thinking that the future has to be the same than the past. So, and I'm not only as big brain science kind of technological utopianist. So I'm very much in favor to establish these kind of democratic social criteria, and not just to rely blindly on technological progress. And this then is about regulation. So finally, I would like to talk 2 minutes about regulation. If you're looking to the success story of the German industry, we are living in a highly regulated country, not only in environmental terms, but also in social terms. Interestingly, the German industry has a share in global exports of around about 7%. But in environmental technologies, in green technologies, it's 15%. Why? Because Germany, partly due to the Green Lung movement, which is not just a partisan movement over the last 30 years, had a relative early and a relative comprehensive system of environmental regulation, and this was stipulating innovation. It started with acid rain, which of course was a real phenomenon in the 70s, or cleaning of rivers, or developing technologies for recycling of waste. This was a very early and primitive stage, but it stimulated technological innovation. Same with the car industry. They would not go alone, of course, to electrical mobility, because this is a devaluation of their know-how and the devaluation of invested capital. There must be some economic and political incentives to stipulate this kinds of transition. And then we have to talk about smart regulation or dumb regulation. Part of smart regulation, and I wonder why an economist is challenging the idea of internalization of cost, because a market economy can only work if you really have prices which are reflecting the true cost of a product and a production. So internalization of cost into the price system is a kind of smart regulation. And then I think we need some framework beyond that, which is more about classical regulation in terms of efficiency, etc., and this kind of stuff. And I don't think that policy or the state should define specific technologies, but it should define a corridor of development. And finally, I think we can have it both. We can have social progress and at the same time moving towards an economy which is no longer acting in nature like an army in a hostile area. But this idea, this is a very utopian idea, I admit, of creating a system of co-evolution between human society and the natural productivity. I think this would be a left utopia worthwhile to work for.
Okay. All our speakers, please. I think this was one of all our speakers. Thank you. I think we had a wonderful panel tonight. Often I'm told the discussions didn't resolve the problems. That's true. But if we don't talk about them, we're not going to resolve the problems in any case. So that's why we like to talk about them. If you are interested in our debates, because we have regular debates, you can put your name on this list and we will invite you to our next debate. I'll just pass the list around maybe. We're also meeting later today in the pub next door for anybody who would like to continue the discussion on a more informal level. Yeah, and I think that's it. So thank you very much to all of you for coming.
Thank you for having us here. Next thing.